So this is going to be a good old-fashioned pirate story, one that hits all the standard bases: ships, plundering, swashbuckling, sailing feats, scientific observations, new plants named, presenting to the Royal Society. What was I talking about? Ladies and gentlemen, meet William Dampier. Now, some of you may remember William Dampier as the man who introduced the word banana to English. But he was so much more in the way that really only a truly neurodivergent, curious spirit could be. Tell me I'm wrong. He was the ultimate enthusiastic amateur. He was kind of unscientific by today's standards, but he was so detailed, objective, and right. So let's get ourselves situated here, where at the end of the 17th century, only about 150 years after Magellan first sailed all the way around the globe, and 100 years after Francis Drake popped by California to say hi, the Royal Observatory in Greenwich had just been founded. The European ships still had no accurate way to measure your longitude, and wouldn't for another 100 years. We wouldn't even agree on the Greenwich Prime Meridian until 1851. Maps said things like "here be dragons" and meant that kind of literally. The Spanish thought California was an island. De Anza only figured out it was connected to the rest of America in 1774. Francis Bacon and the scientific method, oh, come on. You got every other science. Francis Bacon and the scientific method were hot off the presses, thank you. Newton's theory of gravity and Linnaeus' system of taxonomy hadn't quite been published yet. And right into this sails William Dampier. He eventually became the first person to circumnavigate the globe 3 times, not by any grand design, but just rambling out of curiosity. Ships. So, who was this guy? Previous naval heroes like Drake or Magellan were captains of their ships, but not Dampier. From what we can tell, he was born into a middle class, rich enough to be sent to Latin school, but poor enough that when his parents died, his guardians took him back out of school to learn a useful trade to help them pay the bills. That introduced him to sailors at the dock who knew of exciting foreign parts, and he wanted to see those for himself. He sailed to Jamaica in 1674, where he couldn't hold down a regular job, and he fought with his bosses and eventually ended up cutting logwood in the Yucatan. That went fine for a while, but then a storm washed away the whole camp's tools and possessions. But it turns out that in this era, most of the log cutters were temporarily embarrassed buccaneers, let's say, pirates between ships. So it was a natural step from there into piracy. It was also conveniently a free ticket to explore the remote ecosystems of the world. Now, vessels. Every pirate's dream was to capture a Spanish galleon full of South American treasure. But in actual fact, those were few and far between, and very well armed when they did show up. So this crowd's piracy was really very unsuccessful. It didn't help that while his crewmates were pillaging settlements, hunting for Spanish gold, and utterly failing to capture any ships, Dampier was instead writing exhaustively in his journal, obsessing over the local flora, and getting incredibly annoyed that amidst the looting, nobody would fetch him bird and plant specimens. For 12 long years, Dampier's crew dragged him on a rambling, bloody tour of the globe. They raided across Panama, Peru, Chile, prowled the shores of Mexico, the Galapagos. From there, they struck out across the Pacific, Guam, Philippines, China, the Spice Islands, and the shores of New Holland, making them the first English sailors to visit Australia, 100 years before Captain Cook. By the time he got back to England via the Cape of Good Hope, Dampier had accidentally circumnavigated the globe, making it the first of what would be 3 circumnavigations. And yet, when he got back to London, he was utterly destitute. His only possessions were his wax-sealed bamboo tubes of notes and a tattooed enslaved man he'd bought in the Philippines because we can't have nice things. But those journals proved to be worth far more than Spanish gold. When he published them in 1697 as A New Voyage Round the World, the book became a smash hit. And it still is. The SF Public Library has a copy you can check out as soon as I return it. But it wasn't just a popular adventure story. Dampier brought strict empirical science to his pirate diaries. He even dedicated the book to the president of the Royal Society. Suddenly, he was a scientific celebrity. He was invited to lecture at the prestigious Royal Society. He found himself rubbing elbows and dining with Samuel Pepys. The famous diarist John Evelyn, who dined with them, was amazed, writing that Dampier seemed a more modest man than one would imagine by relation of the crew he had assorted with, which is a bit of a backhanded compliment, but, you know, compliment nonetheless. The scientific and political elite delighted in his information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. In 1698, Scotland launched a disastrous, massively funded expedition to colonize Panama, which ultimately bankrupted Scotland and basically led to the Acts of Union. And during this time, the English government was desperate for intelligence on the region. So who did they turn to? The Council of Trade and Plantation summoned our very model of a modern pirate botanist to testify as their foremost expert. His geographical notes and Buccaneer diaries had become a matter of national security. I almost wrote a whole bit, but... His journals had other darker consequences. In Guam, he was the first to accurately describe the breadfruit tree, noting how the natives baked its fruit to taste like the crumb of a penny loaf. Fast forward a century, British plantation owners wanted a cheap, abundant food source to feed the enslaved populations in the West Indies. Remembering Dampier's enthusiastic notes, the Admiralty dispatched a ship to gather breadfruit saplings. That was the HMS Bounty, commanded by Captain William Bligh. And on the way home, drinking water ran short. Captain Bligh decided to water the breadfruit plants instead of his thirsty sailors, and they cast him adrift and dumped the plants overboard, the most famous naval mutiny in history. But anyway, back to the story. Let's leave Bligh drifting in the Pacific. Back to 1690s London, Dampier is the darling of the Royal Society, and a highly sought-after expert. In fact, the First Lord of the Admiralty invited him to design his own expedition. The Admiralty gave him a ship, the HMS Roebuck, to sail back to New Holland on a mission of discovery. This was the first time the Royal Navy had chartered a mission for expressly scientific purposes. But remember I said he hadn't been in a position of authority on any of his past voyages. Well, it turns out he was a brilliant observer, but a disastrous sea captain. His first mate resented being forced to serve under a former pirate and undermined his authority at every turn, eventually getting himself clapped in irons, set ashore, and sent back to England. And the Admiralty also wasn't really keen on the idea of handing a ship to a former pirate, so they picked not really the best ship. In fact, the Roebuck was already rotting and falling apart before they even left England. Despite his terrible leadership and his disintegrating ship, Dampier actually makes it all the way to Australia and on past New Guinea and most of the way home, but eventually the inevitable happens. The Roebuck springs a fatal leak and sinks off of Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic. Dampier and his crew barely survive with their lives and are marooned on a desolate volcanic rock for 5 weeks. By the time they're rescued and returned to England, Dampier found that his former first mate had been talking shit about him ever since he got back. So, in addition to having to answer to the investigation into losing the Roebuck, Dampier was court-martialed in 1702 for hard and cruel usage of an inferior. He was found guilty, stripped of all his pay, and officially declared forever unfit to command any of Her Majesty's ships. But he was still a best-selling author and beloved scientist, and 10 months after he was publicly disgraced and thrown out of the Navy, he was ushered into the royal court, personally introduced to Queen Anne by the Lord High Admiral, and kissed the Queen's hand. The Crown basically said, "We don't care, we need your brain." He wasn't given a Navy ship, but he was handed a new commission to go right back to his old privateering ways. And on his final voyage, he even reached the Holy Grail and helped capture a legendary Spanish galleon loaded with treasure. Unfortunately, pirate rules about dividing up treasure meant that a lot of lawyers got involved, and he died before he saw any of this money. So, lawyers. After a lifetime of plundering, mutinies, and chasing Spanish silver, to find his true treasure, let's look at his debacle as a Royal Navy captain as his ship was sinking into the Atlantic. What did he miraculously save? Not gold, not silver. His journals, his notes, and his carefully pressed Australian plant specimens, at least 24 of which are still beautifully preserved at the Oxford Herbarium today. So, let's tonight raise a glass to probably the worst pirate in the Caribbean, a man driven across the globe by his own relentless curiosity who proved that sometimes the real treasure is the science you did along the way.